In my PhD project, I investigate materiality in Swedish contemporary picture books. And since the theme of this conference was published, the picture book between fiction and reality, I've been thinking a lot about these categories, fiction and reality, and how materiality relates to them. How do I conceptualize or comprehend fiction and reality? Where do I draw the lines or the limits for stories? And what can picture books and their materiality tell us about these questions? In this presentation, I've chosen to delimit this question to a detail that may appear as very subtle, but it challenges me in my thoughts about what stories and their limits are. The picture book We Blew Away Sometimes by Nordgren is a story about two kids. Throughout different seasons, they play and build a treehouse. The spreads are dominated by shifting color palettes, and the pictures are mainly made with crayons. The focus for this analysis is thus the subtle text. In the first spread, the text says, "We waited for the morning." It's written in lowercase, and read with Frank Serafini and Jennifer Clausen, the text is visually discrete. Capital letters are often prompt the reader to read aloud or emphasize more. They can signal screaming or generally attract attention. Lowercase hence signals something more modest or low-key. The lack of initial capital also means that the text forms an almost straight line, without many elements of the letters sticking out or taking up a lot of space. So in some ways, the text is similar to the children in the picture. They also form a line while quietly sitting on the same horizontal level. And maybe the even horizontal line of the text can also be considered sitting in stillness waiting for the morning. Maybe it's included in the otherwise undetermined we in the text. It is this relationship between text visuality and the story that I investigate in this paper. And this belongs to an area of my dissertation that is concerned with how text and image are constituted as separate categories, and what it does with our understanding of the picture book if these limits are problematized or even dissolved. One important point in Serafini and Clausen's article is that text is visual and material. Consequently, it affects the picture book story. Other people also raise awareness of the text materiality. Elina, you're here in the room. I will refer to you in third person here. In the article, The Capricious Alphabet, about the letters materiality in children's literature, Elina Drucker points out that written words have a visual form, a text image, that makes the words material and spatial. In Drucker's examples, these bodily signs are thematized. They can be eaten or break free from the pages. And these examples work with the signs' different levels of meaning in a very distinct way. Drucker explains that they emphasize the physical rather than the metaphysical aspects of words. The text bodies in We Blew Away Sometimes are maybe not as prominent as in Drucker's examples, but the materiality, visuality, form, and placement of the text matters. On the second spread, you can see here, the colors are in bright red, orange, and yellow. The text follows on the wait for the morning earlier, and it says, "When it came, it was the brightest of red." The line of the text rises in an arched line pointing towards a big red sun. It gives the reading direction upwards into the book, but it can also be understood as manifesting the path of the sun. Though subtle, the text relates visually to the story. An even more prominent example can be found in the 8th spread. Here the text proclaims as the title, "We blew away sometimes." Everything in the spread is blowing towards the right, which gives the spread a distinct direction from left to right, also with the background made out of these horizontal crayon lines. The text is again in lowercase, forming a horizontal line, but the distance between the letters increase with each word. The strong wind of the story grabs a hold of the signs and even the text blows away. Here, the story verbally tells us about a strong wind, a we that sometimes blew away. Maybe this we incorporates everything in the spread, including the text. It is clear, however, that even the text is affected by the events of the story. It doesn't just tell us what happens in the story, it also manifests the story. This made me think about how picture book texts work. Are they inside or outside of the story, the diegesis? In what layer of the story does it exist? And are there even any such layers? In Picture Books and Metafiction, a chapter of the Routledge Companion to Picture Books, Maria Cecilia Silva-Diaz discusses how metafiction works in picture books. Metafiction refers to literature that reflects upon and draws attention to its own ontological status as an artifact. This poses questions and shows the gap between reality and the world represented in literature, Silva-Diaz writes. The metafictional traits can be explicit, where the book clearly reflects upon its own construction and creation. But books aren't always so explicit in expressing their status as fiction, Silva-Diaz explains. And she discusses implicit metafiction, where the self-awareness is transferred to the reader. The reader makes visible the book's stitches, inconsistencies, collisions, loans, and shifts in the story's levels, which compels her to realize that the story is an artifact of fiction. Silva-Diaz describes this as metafictional strategies that intentionally and systematically seek to awaken the reader's consciousness. She writes that such metafiction exists in the liminal space between a constructive intentional principle and an effect in the reader. Here, I find it important to remember what is in this space, namely the material book. It exists also beyond an author's intention and the reception of a reader. It has its own agency, and it shapes, affects, and leads in unexpected directions beyond human control. It is also affected. It meets readers with their own outlooks who read the book in different ways, physically and mentally. The readers can also shape further experiences of the book, their own and others. One could imagine that a single reading is a mashup of the author's choices, how the choices are materialized in the book's own being in the world, and its material and immaterial meetings with readers. Here, I'd like to argue that implicit metafiction can be understood and used as exactly that space or meeting where something becomes visible, in this case, stories and their conditions. In We Blew Away Sometimes, the visual text can be considered a form of implicit metafiction. In the fifth spread, the text falls like rain, and it says, "Sometimes the sea fell from the sky." The text acts like the rain and creates, together with other elements in the spread, a distinct vertical direction. In the third spread, the text explains verbally that the tree stood and thought about all the leaves it was going to get. The words are placed around the branches of the tree and perform visually the leaves or the thoughts of the leaves. One could imagine that these clearly visual texts act on several layers of the story, and that they, as implicit metafiction, draw attention to the conditions of stories, or perhaps rather ideas about the conditions of stories. Because is it like that they work on different or multiple levels? Do plateaus as such exist in picture books and other literature? And if they exist, where should one draw the limit between these? And in extension, the final limit, the one that forms the contact surface to our real world. Here, I'd like to problematize the very idea that I started with when working on this paper, the picture book as something between fiction and reality, as something that negotiates and investigates that limit. Is there such a limit? In the chapter, Nothing is Hidden, in Revolution of the Ordinary, Toremoy argues against the hermeneutics of suspicion. When reading suspiciously, the text is considered hiding information under or behind its words. Readers can reveal this by reading on a deeper level. Moore dismisses the idea that the text has surface and depth. Within such a metaphor, the language itself is considered hiding meaning from us. She explains that this is rooted in the idea of the split sign after Ferdinand de Saussure, thus that the sign is split in one completely formal material part, the signifier, which refers to the visible surface, and one buried or hidden part, the signified, the meaning. Materiality and content are thus constituted as two separate categories, or two separate things. If one takes this as a starting point, the creation of meaning is always, by definition, about searching for the hidden, Moore explains. On one hand, there is the sign, the material, the form or the container, and on the other, there is the meaning, the content. I wonder to what extent this is present in our readings of picture books and their materiality. To discuss, for example, materiality as stitches holding the world of fiction together that can be exposed through certain strategies can be considered describing materiality as a construction existing behind or under the story, rather than part of the content. Serafini and Clausen note that materiality carries meaning, but they also describe visual elements as a framework through which words and image can shine through. This could be understood as what Moore describes the ideas of the Saussure, where the text has a surface or form and a content hidden or buried within the sign. Even if materiality has meaning, it is treated as originally separated from content. Drucker makes a point that the material and visualized sign creates or births a relationship between the embodied sign and the room. An interaction between the abstract and the concrete is created, which draws attention to the relationship between text and image and between fiction and reality. Because of that, the limits of fiction and reality are stretched in both text and image. And here some important key points are made. The sign has a real spatial dimension and a relationship to the room in which it takes place. The visualization of the sign affects how we think about text and image. And maybe we could say that such a relationship isn't born when the abstract and the concrete interact, but that the two are the same all the time. Moore supports her argument in Ludwig Wittgenstein and Stanley Cavell, which I find helpful when thinking about the abstract and the concrete as one. Quote, Wittgenstein too thought that human beings are, as Cavell puts it, condemned to expression, to meaning. The famous aphorism, the human body is the best picture of the human soul, is an attempt to make us stop thinking of the body as something that hides the soul, and to make us realize that the body is expressive of soul, which means that it is expressive also of our attempts to hide, disguise, or mask our feelings and reactions. For Wittgenstein, gestures and activities inflect our words. Language cannot be isolated from our tone, our facial expressions, or from what we do with our bodies as we speak or remain silent. End of quote. This can be applied to the material language in the picture books. It becomes especially clear in relation to Drucker's description of letters as bodies. The letters are not bodies, material containers that carries soul or content. Their bodies are soul. Materiality is content. There is no surface to dive under with more. The meaning that is created both verbally and visually cannot easily be separated or connected. The stitches are the story. To describe the limit between fiction and reality as a limit could potentially mean that we, in every attempt to tear it down, simultaneously reconstruct it. Even if we talk about stretching it, we are, on an ontological level, relating to fiction and reality as separate entities. Here, I'd like to clarify that I don't mean that suspicious readings are bad in any sense. They lead to valuable observations and result in important analysis in picture books. Rather, it's about how I can relate to picture books in a way where I can possibly disrupt the ideas that steer my analysis of picture books. What happens if we, with Moy, dismiss the metaphor of surface in an analysis of picture book text, for example? Maybe it means that we have to dismiss the whole question regarding whether the text is inside or outside of the story, because maybe there aren't any firm limits between stories and the world. We could read or understand fiction as such a constructed surface or limit. Hence, we have constructed an image of fiction as a world separate from reality. If fiction is constituted as such an object with a limit or a surface, the reading of it becomes suspicious. We can look underneath and expose its construction and material reality. But with Moy, we can think about the text as not hiding its conditions as material reality, but rather showing us that the story also is reality. So what happens if we dissolve fiction as a concept and relate to stories in a more fluid, limitless way? How can we handle stories if the story world is also the real world, and if fiction exists on the same level as other statements or expressions in the material reality? These questions are too large for a small paper to answer in itself, but I'd like to make a point, namely how literature as materiality can make visible the constructed limits we ontologically relate to and act within. Drucker mentions visualized words as defamiliarization, a concept I would also like to stress in this context. It originates from formalism, and Viktor Shklovsky explains that it refers to the poetic effect of literature to disrupt automatized perception. Materiality has agency and it does something to us. We see something from a different perspective. Materiality is thus involved in our readings, analysis, and knowledge-producing processes. And there's potential in letting literature push us out of our automatized tracks. The construction becomes visible, but maybe not the construction of the material book, but rather the construction that constitutes our ideas of the world around us and limits between entities. Implicit metafiction can be considered a form of defamiliarization. Silva Diaz mentions short circuit, and it refers to the shakeup that happens when levels of the narrative are violated. Rather than thinking of short circuits as strategies dissolving limits between fiction and reality, I'd like to argue that they could be understood as the material aspects that disrupt our ideas about stories. These concepts are useful to track how literature, particularly picture books, can generate those disturbances and disrupt automatized perceptions and create space for thinking about the most familiar in a non-familiar way. With that said, I'd like to argue that the picture book isn't located in the space between fiction and reality, but rather that the picture book, in its disturbing material practices, creates space for thinking without such borders. The picture book is a space to short-circuit our streamlined ideas of existence. It makes space for thinking borderless, a space where words can be leaves, fall like the free sea from the sky, or blow away sometimes. Thank you.